Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer Legendary Lord lore video on Durthu. Now, Durthu is almost as old as the forest of Athel Loren itself, or as Durthu and the rest of the forest spirits tend to refer to it, simply as the Great Forest. The Great Forest itself is thought to have been planted by the Old Ones at some stage, predating the history of elves and dwarves alike. And relatively soon after, as the forest grew and expanded, a number of its oldest trees began to gain a kind of consciousness. Eventually, the entire Great Forest itself became self-aware and became a life form, a unique life form all of its own within the Warhammer world. The center of the Great Forest soon grew to become what we now know as the Oak of Ages. And from the Oak of Ages, a series of root networks began to spring up that would grow around the entirety of the Warhammer world. This network of world roots allowed the forest spirits to travel through them to far-off lands. Eventually, these world roots even reached as far as Ulthuan. Now, Ulthuan is the home island of the elven people. The forest spirits of the Great Forest started to visit that island. On that island, they found a spot that they particularly liked, named Avalon. Now, Avalon itself was a largely forested area and was renowned for its beauty throughout the elven kingdoms. A number of forest spirits, in fact, decided to make Avalon their new home. Their aim was to make their fellow trees in that ancient woodland woke as they had been woke themselves. And in order to achieve this, a number of forest spirits decided to make Avalon their new long-term home, slightly forsaken the great forest of their ancestry, as it were. In the forest of Avalon, there was a lot of interaction between the elves and these forest spirits. The innocence of the elves and their wonderment at nature made them very enamored with the idea of the forest spirits, and soon lines of communication opened up. Perhaps the greatest of the forest spirits that had made Avalon their home was the forest spirit known as Durthu. Durthu himself was not always the creature we know him as today. In fact, he was once renowned as the most kind and compassionate of all the forest spirits, and took a great shining to the elven people, in particular the Everqueen, Ariel. He taught them his secrets, how to mold trees without harming them in any way, shape, or form, how to commune with the spirits of the forest, and they just soaked up the information. They were fascinated by Durthu and his people, and together they forged Avalon into a place of such beauty that calling it a paradise would almost be doing it a disservice. With its idyllic woodland and summer meadows, it had become truly one of the most astounding places in the Warhammer world. Then came the collapse of the Chaos Gates, and chaos poured into the world. Demons stormed forward into this new territory of theirs and started just a sheer destruction of everything that lay upon its surface. The races of the world, as they stood then, mounted a valiant defense. The elves particularly being hunted by these demons, for their souls were thought to have been particularly sweet to these chaos entities who hunted them. But Ariel, the defender, put up a stout defense on the northern coast of Ulthuan. For the most part, chaos seemed to ignore the province of Avalon. They sensed in the forest spirits that they were not dissimilar entities to themselves, and so largely left them alone, preferring to seek easier elven prey elsewhere. Because of this is where the Everqueen and her children with the Phoenix King and Orion took shelter. Initially, wave after wave of chaos invasion of Ulthuan was repelled by the Phoenix King, but eventually they sent a horde of such enormous size that although he engaged it in battle, it was still able to move past him and start to march towards Avalon. Now, the forest spirits could have left and fled Avalon and retreated back to the great forest itself, but instead they stood side by side with their elven friends and fought beside them to the bitter end. In the end, it proved rather hopeless. The size of the Chaos Horde was just too immense to overcome, and the elves were fought back and back and back, deeper into the forest of Avalon. Eventually, there was nowhere left to run. Many forest spirits had spent their life force, and many elves had laid bloodied and mangled on the floor, having their souls devoured by the demons that marched unceasingly forward towards the remaining elves and forest spirits. In her moment of desperation, Ariel turned to Durthu, asking him to please save the lives of her children, taking them through the world routes. Now, to take blooded creatures through the world route was a great violation of the sanctity of the world roots to the forest spirits, and Durthu knew he would face fierce repercussions upon returning home if he carried out this action. However, Durthu, who had become known as Oakheart and who had much loved amongst the elven people, took compassion on Astariel, and as the tears flowed down the Everqueen's face, he thought to himself of what they'd managed to achieve together, how they'd both become wiser and a more strong people thanks to working together rather than acting individually. And he came with a compromise. He agreed that he would take the 2 children of the Everqueen to the great forest across the ocean. But in exchange, a price had to be paid, and that price was that the great forest would one day claim many elves for its own. And so Astariel had to sacrifice some of her people in the future to save the future of the elven heirs in the present. Astariel was slightly put off by Durthu's ominous tone, but in her desperation had to agree. At that very moment, a greater demon of chaos barged through the front line of battle and annihilated what was left of Astariel's bodyguard. It was in fact no simple greater demon, but Nakari, the foremost servant of Slaanesh, who particularly enjoyed devouring on elven souls. And as he crushed and eviscerated the last of her bodyguard, Astariel kissed her 2 children goodbye, summoning the last remnants of the magic available to her, marched slowly down the hill towards her destiny. Durthu, keeping his word, disappeared into the world roots and returned back to the Great Forest. Upon returning to the Great Forest, he found it drastically changed. Its borders had receded to making the Great Forest a fraction of what it once was the last time he'd set foot in it, and what remained was sandwiched between 2 mountain ranges. Of the thousands of elders that once existed over the full length and breadth of the Great Forest, there now only 3 were left. There was Durthu himself, said to have been the most compassionate and kind of his people. There was Athel, who was said to be the wisest of the elders. And there was Coedil, who was said to be the canniest. And these 3 were the only ones left of the thousands of Treeman elders who had once walked the great forest of the old world. But all was not lost, however. The current forest as it stood had held its lines for over a decade against the waves and waves of chaos intrusions. The saplings, as he'd once known them, had changed in their aspect and become much more warlike, thickening their branches, providing a sturdy armor against attack, and becoming much more wild and aggressive in their actions, and some would even go as far as describing them as now cruel creatures. In this last bastion, these tree spirits had been holding off the Chaos Hordes and had started to expand back outwards, expanding their borders slightly over the last few years. And although things were not as dire as they perhaps appeared to Durthu in terms of their military situation upon his return, he was, however, not greeted with open arms, having breached the sanctity of the world roots and marched these blooded creatures through them. Athel and Coedil were both incensed by his actions, and Coedil particularly demanded the death of the 2 elven children. Athel, though initially appalled, had come round to the thinking of Durthu and had agreed with him that the children can stay with them, but only under the condition that they remain in a comatose-like state induced by magic. And Athel agreed to this because he was worried that this kind of cycle of violence they had entered would see the end of their peace-loving ways and would change the forest spirits forever. And this one act of kindness may be a beacon of light and compassion in what had become an otherwise very dire situation for the forest spirits, who had almost completely given themselves over to anger and pain and battle. Eventually, and to the surprise of the forest spirits, the tides of chaos subsided. The elves had, in their ingenuity, discovered a magical spell which would enable a vortex in Ulthuan that would suck out all the excess chaos magic of the world, and thus effectively make it impossible for vast numbers of demons to exist in the Warhammer world. This brought a whole new era of peace over the world, although much of it had just been completely devastated. Once peace was established, Durthu kept his promise and returned the children to Ulthuan, where they were welcomed back by their own people. They of course had no recollection of the events. They only remembered once being saved by Durthu, but beyond that, nothing had ever occurred to them due to the magic-like trance they'd been placed in. Centuries passed, and the tales of the great and benevolent forest spirits soon faded in the memory of even the long-lived elves. Over time, earthquakes and tectonic activity had severed the world route that stretched around the Warhammer world. And in their effort to rebuild, the forest spirits themselves had little wish to venture outside of their own borders, just looking to protect what little of the great forest they had left after the calamity of chaos. As the years rolled into decades, rolled into centuries, rolled into millennia, the people of Ulthuan, the elven people, became an increasingly powerful race, and eventually looked to stretch out and see what had become of the devastated world they once knew. They ended up colonizing much of what is now the lands of Bretonnia, and even venturing into some parts of what would become known as the Empire. Over the course of these travels, they encountered the dwarves, and a solid friendship was forged, and together they battled what remnants of chaos were left in the world. On their travels through the lands that would one day become known as Bretonnia, they discovered the forest of Athel, Loren, and they were drawn to it, seeing magic glowing lights and seeming spirits and ghosts wandering through its glades. And it said that this bond with the forest would become part of their blood due to the bond that Ariel had made with Durthu. They were drawn to the forest and indeed set up many settlements just outside of its borders, for whenever any attempt was made to venture into the forest, they would often find themselves in a kind of shifting landscape that would just lead them back out. And on rare occasions, elves were known to have gone missing, to never return from the forest, which they would go on to name as Athel Loren. In an effort to protect themselves from any kind of malevolent forces that they suspected may live within the forest, they put waystones around its boundary and set up settlements around its edge. Eventually, due to tensions and political machinations within the elven world, the War of the Beard broke out, where the dwarves went to war with the elves. Over the course of hundreds of years, essentially devastating both dwarven and elven empires from an age of great prosperity which they can never really hope to recoup. The dwarves eventually managed to drive the elves from what would one day become known as the Old World, the elves abandoning their colonies there, but some elves refused. The elves who lived around the sort of forest edge of Athel Loren decided not to heed the call of the Phoenix King at the time and returned back to Ulthuan. Around the same time, a group of dwarves who were on the warpath looking to hunt elves wandered into the forest of Athel Loren. The forest spirits put on a valiant fight led by Durthu himself, and due to the fact that winter was encroaching and it had slowed the forest spirits, they could not hope to mount a resistance large enough to hold off this dwarven force. Durthu himself was severely injured and forced to retreat, and as the dwarves then went on to chop down and burn significant portions of the forest as they marched through it, Durthu became enraged, and he thought of a new plan to deal with the dwarves. If they could not defeat the dwarves themselves, they could use the elves to do it. Following through this idea, Durthu bade the forest itself guide the dwarves through it to lead them directly into the path of the elven settlements. The elves, of course, thinking they were under attack due to still being in the midst of the War of the Beard, immediately launched an offensive against the dwarves and followed them into the forest into which they retreated. The forest itself now seeming not to resist the elves as they marched through it, but indeed allowing them to move almost impossible distances in very short amounts of time, allowing them to ambush and continually harry this dwarven army. And eventually the dwarves, who could not lay an axe on any of the elves as they seemed to disappear and reappear at impossible speeds and distances around this forest, retreated out of Athel Loren, and the forest was rid of them. Fearing reprisal, the elves themselves decided to, now they seem to have been welcomed by the forest, decided to move in and move all their settlements out of the border area because they feared the dwarves would come back and to hunt them all down and kill them all. So they moved into the forest, and to their surprise, still in fact, they were not met with any resistance. Little did they know of the furious argument occurring between Durthu and Coadil about the future of the elves and their place within the forest of Athel Loren. Durthu himself had placed himself out of the argument. So filled was he with rage and hatred for what had happened to him and for his injury, and for the trees they'd lost to the dwarves that he felt responsible for, that he withdrew himself from the argument. Eventually, Durthu managed to win round Coadil to the extent that he would put up with the elves for now, accepting that perhaps they could not defend themselves all round and this might be a mutually beneficial relationship. However, Durthu, the wisest and now emerging as the leader of the remaining elders of the forest, decided that they wouldn't make themselves known as forest spirits to the elves, and they would avoid them at all costs, just using them more as a shield to help defend the forest when they could not. Durthu, having won the argument, and although concealing the existence of forest spirits, allowed the elves to learn some of the secrets of the forest, but not all of them. In this light, some of the more powerful magic users within the elven populace, chief amongst whom was Ariel, their most powerful mage, began to learn to communicate with the trees, and indeed she became the first tree singer and taught the skill to the other adept elves. And so time rolled on. However, the dwarves do not forget, and grudges they like to keep, and eventually the dwarves raised another army, and they looked to settle the grudge with the forest spirits they'd encountered, and with the elves who dared resist them. However, on the other side of Athel Loren, there was also a huge army of greenskins amassing, and the greenskins were looking to assault the forest and assault the dwarves in the mountain ranges beyond. So Athel Loren was the target of, and also caught between, two warring factions. The elves, being aware of the situation, called a great council of all the lords of the different regions of Athel Loren. Together, they debated strategy, and it seemed as though their gathering space in the sort of open meadow, as it were, had begun to close in, as the trees themselves seemed to be leaning in to hear the conversation. The elves thought themselves hopelessly outnumbered, but with nowhere left to run, they had little choice but to stand and fight. And it was at this moment that Durthu, Coadil, and Durthu had decided to make themselves known to the elves and to help them fight off this threat. However, they had to move quickly. Winter was approaching, and they told the elves of their weakness when the winter rolls around. And so together, the wood elves and the great spirits marched against the dwarven army, and indeed they won a fantastic and glorious battle, raining down arrows, using the strength of the forest spirit to split asunder the dwarven armor, and the dwarves had little answer for them. However, almost as soon as the last dwarf was slain on the field of battle, a bitterly cold wind blew across the battlefield, and indeed, winter snow began to fall from the sky. The forest spirits, essentially becoming increasingly stiff and slowed, could no longer offer up any real help towards the wood elves. And so as the wood elves turned to try and face the greenskin army that was now marching into Athel Loren, they simply did not have the numbers to match that of the great greenskin horde that was coming into their territory. Eventually, the wood elves were forced to continuously retreat, trying to use the forest as best they could, but with sheer numbers, the greenskins seemed to be overwhelming the forest in its entirety. At the end, they were pushed back to the Oak of Ages itself as the greenskin horde marched relentlessly on towards them, looking to hack them up with their big choppers. It was just at this moment, as the greenskin horde had begun to engage the last fleeting defense of the wood elves, that an enormous boom was heard, and out of the Oak of Ages marched forth the gigantic figure of Kurnos, the elven god of the hunt, and he began to smite the hordes of greenskins with his mighty spear, cleaving out divots from the land, killing dozens with every strike. The greenskins, terrified and losing troops by the hundreds, began to break and flee, and the wild riders and the glade guard began to pepper them with arrows and ride them down. And indeed, this prompted an enormous counterattack, which saw the wood elves chase out and ride down any of the remaining greenskin horde. The day was won thanks to the appearance of Kurnos, who seemingly at the end of the battle turned round and marched straight back into the Oak of Ages. Then, at that very moment, the oak opened up, and two people who'd been missing since the Great Council, some people had noticed, but really there'd just been too much going on to worry too much about these two missing lords, were the lords Orion and Ariel. Orion being the mightiest warrior the elves had at the time, and Ariel being their mightiest magic user. But indeed, they had been changed, and in fact had both become avatars of elven gods. Ariel becoming the avatar of Isha, the goddess of nature for the elves, and Orion becoming the avatar of Kurnos, their god of the hunt. And these two emerged to become essentially the king and queen of Athel Loren. Now, as far as Durthu and the elders were concerned, Ariel in particular seemed to be in touch with the weave, which was essentially the magic of a kind of magical network of life that propagated itself throughout the forest of Athel Loren, and so these two rulers had become as much entwined and part of the forest as the elders themselves, and so they accepted that these two would rule, at least primarily over the elves of the forest, but the elders too would follow their orders if need be. A period of peace followed this great alliance between the forest spirits and the elves. The elves aided to protect the forest when the forest spirits could not, and vice versa, and they worked together when they needed the strength of arms. Kurnos' thirst for battle in the hunt continued and led to him leading many wild hunts against the beastmen, who were a near constant threat in the forest of Athel Loren, but the elves helped keep their numbers seemingly under control, and Orion and the elves did their part and were valued as partners within the great forest itself. A number of years passed in relative peace for the wood elves and the forest spirits. Eventually, Ariel, or Ariel, however you prefer to say it, felt a disturbance in the weave. Now, the weave, as I mentioned, is this kind of network, or think of it maybe as the Force in Star Wars, but between sort of all, I suppose just as the Force, a sort of balance between living things that she can kind of instinctively sense. And she sent a huge disturbance that could be potentially just catastrophically devastating for all life. And she goes and she sort of flies off to find out what this disturbance is. And she discovers it's a beastman, and it's a beastman who she hasn't encountered before, and because it is a beastman, she slightly underestimates it. She thought it would be a great sort of chaos sorcerer or general that was threatening the world, but indeed all she found was this, what she perceived as a mindless beastman, and she rained down sort of fireballs upon him and thought the deal was done and returned back to Athel Loren. However, what she had not realized was that in fact this was Morghur, and Morghur could heal and regenerate and was almost a living vessel of chaos corruption. And Morghur had now learned that there was this soul of this elven goddess living on this world that he was looking to devour and absorb the powers of, and this became his living wish. And this is when Morghur started his long-lasting war on the Wood Elves, now that he'd realized that a being such as Ariel existed. Over the next 200 years, Morghur set about breeding a massive war herd, the likes of which could march on the Oak of Ages itself, to enable him to capture and devour the powers of Ariel. And indeed, after these 2 centuries, this enormous beastman war herd marched on the forest of Athel Loren itself. And through a number of engagements, fighting him all the way, no wood elf could seem to lay low Morghur. He just kept regenerating. He kept coming. Him and his war herd. There seemed to be no end of them. And it wasn't until a final decisive battle where Codel managed to grab this living embodiment of chaos corruption in his hands, and using the opportunity, Ariel summoned all her magic energy and began to draw magic energy from the great forest itself in order to rain down magical flames on Morghur, essentially reducing him to piles of blood and ash, completely destroying his body in an effort to stop him regenerating. And indeed, at first appearances, this completely seemed to have worked. But with all the blood of Morghur's that was spilt over this spot, and the fact that Morghur's blood was corrupting to anything it touched, and no living thing could ever really truly recover after having been exposed to him. And indeed, during some of these running battles with the forest spirits and the wood elves, many of the forest spirits became temporarily corrupted by Morghur and would turn on their friends and allies and fight them instead of fighting the enemy. And often this effect was temporary and was reversed after Morghur moved far enough away from them. But it had a devastating effect on morales of armies within the Wood Elves. But now the creature had been slain, his blood had spilt across the floor of this battlefield, and from then on, nothing could really grow there. What had been once a mighty oak that had grown in this glade became gnarled and corrupted and rooted, and forever on this place was known as the Glade of Woe within Athel Loren. But for the time being, the threat seemed to have been waylaid, Morghur seems to have been defeated, and the Wood Elves could return to a state of peace. And indeed they did for some 500 odd years. But during this time, Codel, who had long resented the Wood Elves' presence in the forest, had started to grow increasingly bitter and angry. Some argued that this was the growing influence of the blood of Morghur that had been spilt over Codel in that decisive battle those many years ago, and some just say it was a natural progression of his ongoing resentment towards the Wood Elves. But whatever it was, at some point, Codel and his forces of dryads had hatched a plan. They planned to stop the rebirth of Orion, which occurred every year. Every year, a new host for Orion would be picked, he'd be placed in the Oak of Ages, and he'd come out as Orion. Their thinking was, if we kill all the wild riders, there'll be nobody to take up the mantle of Orion, and if Orion emerges at all, he'll be in a much more weakened state, and we'll be able to deal with him. But we'll wait until Ariel goes to sleep. For the winter, this is. So, Codil, one of the last remaining free Treeman elders, hatches this plan, and indeed, him and his dryads set upon the King's Glade and begin to massacre every wild rider they can find. But as soon as the first drop of elven blood fell in the King's Glade, it immediately awoke Ariel, and Codil and his forces could not resist just the sheer power of her magic, and so they ended up being captured and stopped in their plans. And although she may have wanted to, Ariel could not punish Codil by killing him. Killing him would be like killing part of the forest, and indeed, by killing part of the forest, it'd be like killing a part of herself. So instead, she decided to imprison him and his other traitorous dryads were imprisoned in the Wild Wood, where no elf has set foot in since, because if you do cross the waystones that they placed there to keep Codil and his kin trapped, you would surely be killed by them if you were an elf and entered that territory. Once what would become known as the Great Betrayal was dealt with, life in Athel Loren began to resume some sort of normalcy. In fact, the clans of men who lived by the forest had begun to unite and had indeed formed the Kingdom of Bretonnia, and on several occasions the Wood Elves and the Bretonnian had cause to ally themselves. And this opened up lines of communication with the outside world, something that Athel Loren hadn't had really for a very long time. When they opened up these lines of communication, the elves of Athel Loren learned about the Sundering, the civil war of the elves, with Malekith leading what would become known colloquially as the Dark Elves, and then the Phoenix King remaining on the throne for what were known as the High Elves. Now, they were perturbed by this because remember that the elves of Athel Loren, as far as they were concerned, they still kind of considered themselves one people. Just because they didn't want to return to Ulthuan, they kind of considered themselves separate. But to find out that their homeland had been split asunder into these two warring factions was quite a blow. Alisara, who was Ariel's sister, had learned that her husband, Malekith, was in fact leading these Dark Elves, and thinking she could talk some sense into him to unify the elven people once more, she had decided to go over to Nagaroth and talk some sense into him, and she sent word to Malekith ahead of time that she was coming, and reluctantly Ariel agreed to let her go. However, any of you who know anything about Malekith know that he is the ultimate mother's boy. And he told his conniving, schemish mother, the witch Morathi, or Morify if you prefer. And she, not wanting her boy's wife to interfere with her plans for him, and to maybe talk him down from looking to claim the Phoenix throne for himself, decided to deal with the situation. And she did this by disguising herself and seducing a prince of Ulthuan, convincing him that this wood elf contingent about to travel to Naggaroth to talk to Malekith were in fact going to join Naggaroth and betray Ulthuan. And so the prince set off to try and attack them, and Morghur disguised the wood elves through magic to make them look like dark elves. The prince killed them all. She lifted the magic spell. The prince realized what he'd done, jumped off a cliff. There's a bit more on this in my Ariel lore video. You can check that out. It should pop up on the right-hand corner. But I'm just trying to breeze through it because it's not directly related to Durthu, but it's kind of stuff that explains what happens next in the story of Athel, Loren, and of Durthu to a certain degree. So, the sister of Ariel is dead, and Ariel goes on the warpath. She marches out, she delves into darker magics that she hasn't dared use before, and these allow her to restore the world roots to Ulthuan. So she travels the world routes with an army, marches on the lands of this prince, slaughters a bunch of his people, but they were a bit hesitant as well because these are living embodiments in Ariel and Orion of their own gods. So they don't want to sort of strike down their own gods. So it just becomes a complete bloodbath. Ariel finds out that Morghur was the one responsible, corners her, and just as Orion is about to cuss out her heart, Morghur senses the dark magic off of Ariel and cuts her a deal. She says, "I'll teach you more dark magics if you let me live." And Ariel, having already been slightly corrupted by the dark magic she used, thinks to herself, I can probably do some good with this magic. You know, all roads to hell are paved with good intentions and all that. I can probably restore the world roots. I can restore Athel, Loren to some of its former glory. Okay, I'll take the deal. And on their way back to Athel, Loren, Orion is giving her shit about her decision the whole way back. He's like, how could you do that? That was a horrible decision. This was terrible. To the point that once they returned, and then as winter drew near and Orion returned to Ash, the following spring, Ariel did not bring him back and continued to delve into her studies of the darker magics. While all this was going on, a strange shroud started to descend upon the whole of Athel, Loren, where once forest spirits and elves had cohabitated quite happily. Now the forest spirits would turn on elves and kill them in ways they hadn't done since the formation of their alliance. And the life in Athel, Loren began to become this sort of daily struggle for survival, rather than a pleasant woodland paradise. And what seemed more strange to those who weren't necessarily affected by this shroud that had enveloped the whole of the great forest was that no one seemed to notice this horrific change happening. Everyone's perspective seemed to be skewed, and they seemed to have thought that this was what life was like all the time. This continued for many, many years, and still, year after year after year, Ariel refused to revive Orion. And during this period, Ariel often sent out her soldiers to kill human settlements, to attack the dwarves for perceived slights that had occurred to them in their history. If Bretonnians even got too close, they'd be absolutely slaughtered even if they weren't in the wood itself. And Athel, Loren became a horribly dangerous place. At some point, Morghur himself was resurrected. Now this time, instead of looking to kill Morghur, she decided to try and do what Morghur was looking to do to her, and devour Morghur. So she sent out the army to entrap Morghur, sent a number of her tree singers to ensnare him with magic and transport him through the world route to the Oak of Ages, where she could carry out the ritual. Durthu, having sensed this complete corruption of the world roots, not only was this a creature not of the wood elves and not of the forest spirits, but it was the great chaos corruptor. It's essentially she'd brought chaos straight into the heart of Athel, Loren. And Durthu was enraged, already now being very much changed from the kind-hearted teacher he'd once been all those millennia ago to the elves. He was now solely really focused on destruction and warfare, but despite that, even now he knew that this was a sacrilege that could not go unanswered. And he himself traveled to the Oak of Ages, and seeing what was happening was even more just in shock. He couldn't believe his eyes at what Ariel was trying to do. And knowing that she needed Morghur to be alive for the ceremony to take place, he quickly struck down Morghur, killing him and effectively ruining the ceremony for Ariel. Ariel was enraged and started screaming at Durthu, seemingly within moments of lifting her hand to aggressively cast some sort of magic spell upon him or do him harm. Durthu could read in her eyes that she hesitated at the very last moment, for he knew that she knew that to strike him down would be something that the rest of the forest spirits would find unforgivable, and at the moment she had nowhere near the strength of arms to fight off the forest spirits if they turned against the elves within the forest of Athel Loren itself. So although Ariel was enraged and Durthu was enraged, no one came to blows, and Durthu retreated back to the area of Athel Loren of which he'd really become the guardian and the overseer. Now Durthu, realizing this, had began to have conversations with Adenhu, who of course, if you remember, is the wisest and oldest of the Treemen elders, of which now only 2 were really free and interacting with the world, with Coadil being locked away in the wild wood. Durthu and Adenhu had both began to feel the withering of the forest itself. The great heart of the forest of Athel Loren was withering away and dying, and they knew that they could not allow this to go on, allow the darkness of Ariel to corrupt the entirety of the great forest and to destroy their home effectively. They had to step in and do something. So quietly they began to gather up troops of forest spirits and elves who had not been affected by this shroud of darkness that had really gone over vast swathes of the forest of Athel Loren, and they started to gather a force to them. They were also joined by a powerful mage known as Nyeth, who was a tree singer who also had been unaffected by the dark magics and corruption, if you will, of what had been going on with Ariel and her use of these ill-begotten powers. So they march on the King's Glade, just looking to have an audience with Ariel. Adenhu thinks he can still convince her. There's still goodness that lies within her, and he can convince her to change her ways and become the monarch of Athel Loren that she had been previously. However, there was no convincing her, and she ordered her troops to charge in to attack the forces of Durthu and Adenhu, and a clash proceeded. Now, knowing that they had the much smaller force, they couldn't hold out against the full-on assault of all of these ensnared wood elves and forest spirits that Ariel had under her command, that Adenhu himself tapped into the weave. Remember, this magical network that connects all life, that the elders can tap into and the Ariel can tap into, and decided to draw out all the corruption and evil that had made a home in Ariel's heart and draw it into himself. And so he did. And Adenhu, with a lot of pain, drew in all of the darkness into himself, and it immediately extinguished life within the eldest of the forest spirits, and he collapsed and died. But the veil had been lifted from Athel Loren, and almost immediately the wood elves and the forest spirits came to their senses and ceased fighting, and Ariel herself, overcome with the shock of what she'd caused to happen, of the death of the oldest of the tree men, fled in horror into the Oak of Ages, and it sealed itself shut behind her. Eventually, that spring, Orion rose for the first time in what seemed like an age and led the people of Athel Loren going forward. But forest spirits had lost a truly important person to them, the elder, and the wood elves themselves had seemingly lost Ariel, who had shut herself away and was refusing to emerge for any reason whatsoever. Durthu was grief-stricken by this loss of his dear friend Adenhu, and this added on to the sorrow and grief and bloodlust and war that he'd been going through, and it truly managed to change him almost seemingly irreparably from the once kind elder he had been. Now he was just concerned with destruction, still prioritizing the protection of Athel Loren, but not hesitating in meting out punishment for any intruders, and happily taking life and showing little to any compassion or remorse for the lives he was taking. He'd become a destroyer rather than a creator, anger-filled and bitter rather than kind and compassionate, and this is very much how Durthu went on. He's had a number of other upcoming battles, During the time of the Errantry Wars in Bretonnia, when Bretonnia was looking to eliminate all the greenskins from their land, a horde of greenskins were actually driven into Athel Loren itself. Now, the forest used its old tactic of having two armies deal with each other rather than having to confront them each individually, and the forest itself guided the greenskins into the horde of beastmen who had risen up that year, and the greenskins handily dealt with them. But drunk on their victory, the greenskins didn't stop there and started chopping and hacking away at the forest around it. But little did they know that they were chopping and hacking away in the province that was under the control of Durthu, and his vengeance was swift and terrible. He went plowing through the greenskin hordes, just slashing dozens of them with single swings of his sword, which had been forged for him by Dave, famous elven smithy. And this sword was really a symbol of his commitment to destruction now, rather than the creator of life he had once been. He rained down furious blows on this greenskin horde, and the greenskin war boss known as Barker decided to challenge Durthu, only to have himself and his boar stomped into pulp with a single tread of Durthu's foot. And so Durthu once again protected Athel Loren from any kind of threat and easily did away with this greenskin mass. The next time Durthu really came under any kind of threat was another grave incident for Athel Loren. Kemmler, who was living in the Grey Mountains at the time, had come down looking to raise corpses for a campaign against Bretonnia, which he had done previously. Now, Heinrich had gone into Athel Loren hunting for cairns, and there are a number of cairns housing thousands upon thousands of dead bodies within Athel Loren. Now, these are not strictly elven cairns. There are some built by sort of ancient races of men that presumably made some buildings in the forest at some point, although this isn't really spoken of, and there are some of just mysterious origin. But suffice it to say, there are a number of dead bodies sitting there for any old necromancer to stumble upon and make full use of, covering himself in a series of enchantments to allow him to pass through the waystones of Athel Loren. Heinrich immediately set upon these cairns and started setting up ritual fires. Now, some scouting wild riders saw him, but it was already too late. Immediately around the feet of their stags, corpses started to rise up out of the ground and killed any of their scouts threatening to report back to the central authorities of Athel Loren. Now, in a very short time, with this vast resource of untapped corpses, Heinrich managed to raise an enormous undead army. His plan, although initially was to march on Bretonnia, he felt an unknown force kind of drawing him towards the center of Athel Loren and felt he should investigate. So he takes this vast army of the undead and immediately begins to reap destruction upon the forest of Athel Loren. Now, this is an undead army within the boundaries of Athel Loren, the likes of which has never been seen before. And to add to this, Heinrich seems to have timed his attack to coincide with the onset of winter. Now, no one really knew he was coming with this vast horde. Every sort of scouting party he seemed to come across were immediately the victims of his horde. And as he made his way through Athel Loren, as with all of the enemies of Athel Loren, the forest itself tried to trick him with its shifting landscape. But Heinrich, having his knowledge of magic and the ways of the world and just his intelligence, was never tricked by this shifting landscape of the forest and seemed to be able to uncannily navigate his way through the defenses of Athel Loren. He was soon near enough that he set his feet on the path to the Oak of Ages. At this point, however, the corruption of the undead was sensed by the forest spirits themselves, and immediately a pack of dryads set upon the undead, but the hordes of undead were so vast that they quickly overwhelmed the dryad. Soon the screams of these suffering woodland spirits began to echo throughout Athel Loren, and they woke none other than Durthu himself. Grabbing his enormous blade, Durthu quickly marched towards the screams he heard, and just as the last dryad fell silent, Durthu emerged from the forest and immediately began raining down destruction on this army of the undead. Heinrich, quickly realizing that he could never overcome such a ferocious creature with just the numbers of undead, it would take him time, but he could single-handedly just strike down every corpse Heinrich could raise. Heinrich started to target his dark magics directly at Durthu. Durthu, shielding himself, began to take some serious hits, however, and began to stumble and shuffle back with the magical damage that Heinrich was raining down upon him. Now, Durthu, had he had time to get close enough, could have perhaps taken Heinrich, and Heinrich, had he had time, could have perhaps brought down Durthu with his magics. But as the two were dueling amongst the swarms of undead gathered around Durthu's feet, a rain of arrows began to pummel and thump into the walking corpses. And indeed, Lords Arlas and Ariel, who are the two lords of the closest provinces to Heinrich's army at the time, had marched in with their Eternal Guard, their archers, and their wild riders. The Eternal Guard engaged this undead horde from the front, while the wild riders swiftly ran around the flanks, attempting to dispose of this undead abomination. Durthu, now joined by allies, had his vigor renewed and again immediately began cutting down huge swathes of Kemmler's army. Kemmler, in his desperation, decided to call up his trump card and scream to the heavens, whereupon 12 terrorgeists descended from above the clouds and started to just lay waste to the ranks of Eternal Guard who had come to reinforce Durthu. As these terrorgeists tore into the Eternal Guard, the ranks of wood elves could be seen wavering. Indeed, the only creature not wavering on the side of order that day was Durthu, who was steadfast in his destruction and lust for battle against this undead corruption. Knowing that their troops might soon break, the lords Arlas and Ariel knew that action was required to inspire them. Ariel immediately beckoned over his forest dragon, leapt upon its back and took to the skies. They immediately engaged one of these swooping terrorgeists and managed to bring the abomination crashing down onto a regiment of the undead horde that had gathered below. Arlas, for his part, a powerful magic user, grew a spark into a tremendous fireball and unleashed it upon the undead hordes, causing untold destruction. This galvanized the Wood Elf troops, and they recovered from their rout to re-engage the undead masses. But Kemmler was far from done. One of the terrorgeists swooped down and engaged Ariel and his dragon, knocking Ariel from his mount and going in for the kill. However, Durthu reached up and wrestled the terrorgeist out of the air, pummeling it into the ground until all of its reincarnated bones had been pulverized into powder. Durthu continued his rampage through the undead masses, trying to work his way towards the necromancer himself. And as the winds of magic began to sputter around him, not enabling him to enact any more of his own magic gifts, Kemmler found his situation increasingly desperate. At this point, having suffered wounds from the flying arrows, from the magic being rained down by Arlas, Heinrich could barely regenerate from his own injuries, let alone manage to hold together this army of the undead, and he summoned over his last remaining terrorgeist, leapt upon its back, and escaped the battle, having lost to the power of Durthu and the other Wood Elf lords. And again, Durthu had proved his worth in the protection of his beloved forest. And although changed and not the compassionate, loving teacher he once was, this force of destruction can serve the forest well in its protection. Durthu himself has very much gone on like this. He is focused on destruction and hatred to such an extent that it's verging on driving the great elder mad. One thing Durthu doesn't realize is that he within himself has the power to restore his mind to what it once was, but he's so consumed by this hatred that it's constantly distracting him from his full potential and the abilities such as he has them. Because as with all the elders of the forest, as it once stood when they numbered in the thousands, when an elder of the forest dies, their essence is transferred into those who remain standing. So between Durthu and Coadil, they have the essence and the power of all of the thousands of elders who have existed and passed out of this world before them. This makes them two uniquely powerful individuals within Athel Loren. And due to these gifts, Durthu does have the power to heal himself both physically and mentally and become the compassionate leader he once was. But as his state of mind is at the moment, he just doesn't have the ability to do so. And indeed, sometimes this power oozes out in a kind of instinctual way, giving him the access to the magic he has, and often even conjuring up beings out of thin air. He's known to be able to conjure up sprites who manifest, who are really just manifestations of Durthu's inner sorrow, and they're said to whisper to him in his sleep of all the ways in which he has failed Athel Loren, already increasing the depths of Durthu's madness, hatred, and sorrow. Suffice it to say, the warrior Durthu has become armed with blade may be what Athel Loren needs in times of strife, but there is so much more potential within Durthu to truly lead Athel Loren into another golden age, should he only turn around and realize his potential and return to being, as he once was, Durthu the Oakenheart, the noblest of his kind. And that about sums it up for our Durthu lore video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do drop a like if you did, and please do subscribe for more Total War Warhammer content, whether it be lore, gameplay, or news. And thanks again for joining me, guys, and I hope to see you on the next one.